That's one of my children.
Legacy Sabbath School class, if I can see you out there. There we go. Anyway, we want to welcome you again today to Roy Branson. And we're today, Rodney Corker is going to discuss neuroplasticity. Next week, you're coming back.
If I'm allowed.
If you're allowed. Do we get the vote at the
I have
end?
to earn the right to do that.
Okay. So anyway, and then after that, it's a TBD, to be determined. We're looking at more spirituality, different issues that we've discussed in the past. And I'm glad to see Eduardo back. You know, Eduardo likes mushrooms, and I guess he found some mushrooms that were not good for soup. So anyway, but it was very touch and go, I think. So, but anyway, we're glad you're here. And so, again, at this time, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Corker, and you can introduce yourself and do whatever you want.
As I wish.
Okay.
But first of all, let's just bow our heads for a word of prayer. Because this is an iPodcast, I will introduce myself a little bit more formally, as David requested that I do that. Dear God in heaven, you have created some mighty things. We are constantly in awe as we discover more and more about your creations. But there's nothing as profound and as incomprehensible as the human brain. It's just a magnificent piece of engineering, and we salute you for it. It's a marvelous thing. And today we're going to have a look at that brain. We're going to open it up and see what we can learn about how you intend to interface with us, how the Holy Spirit does what the Holy Spirit does, how that divine human interface actually occurs within a living, functioning human brain. So as you look down on us, we'd ask that you'd bless us, that you would approve of our ponderings and our meditations, and smile upon us when we make mistakes. My name is Rodney. That's how you know me. Academically in circles, maybe I'm Dr. Rodney Corker, but it's something I don't recognize and I don't invoke, because with a face like that and a bunch of hair like that, how could I be a doctor?
Einstein looked like that.
Yes, that's right. We could be mates. But I'm not channeling Einstein, I promise you. I was born and raised in Western Australia on a dirt farm in the southwest of Western Australia. Spent my early years as a farm laborer, hunter, shooter, trapper, and that's how I earned money to put shoes on my feet and eventually get myself back into education. I was also a sheep shearer, and that was better money than trapping and hunting. But eventually, my first degree was in occupational therapy, which introduced me to some of the concepts that I'm going to share with you today. Because as an occupational therapist, I was fortunate enough to be the World Rehab International Trainee in 1972. It took me to New York, NYU, Rusk Institute of Rehabilitation Medicine, worked on the research unit there, and in the area of neurotrauma. So I spent a lot of my early years working on neurological assessments, go around the 4 lobes of the brain and do cognitive assessments, sensory motor assessments, perceptual assessments, memory assessments, and engaging in training, stimulation and training programs as best we understood it back in the 70s and the 80s, and it has progressed somewhat since then. But I've had this long-term interest in neuroplasticity, adaptation, integration, and that was part of my life. And I taught functional anatomy at a university in Western Australia, and in that functional anatomy, part of that was gross neuroanatomy, along with kinesiology and movement and some of those other science areas. So that was my background. Eventually I was able to win an award, a Callum Fellowship, and come here to America. I chose to come to Loma Linda, did my first degree in services, progressed down to UCLA, where I did a doctorate in healthcare economics, business management, master's background in both healthcare planning and healthcare policy analysis. So I have strong interest in healthcare policy. I filed my dissertation at 4 o'clock one afternoon and started working for Adventist Health at 8 o'clock the next morning, and so it rolled on. And I spent 20 years as a president of Adventist Health, director, vice president of Adventist Health, managed care, and 6 of those years we co-joined with Loma Linda back in the 90s, with Dave Hinshaw's latter time, and I rebuilt the managed care program at Loma Linda and helped build the integrated delivery systems that exist in Loma Linda. So that's my background. I retired early, and part of why I retired early in my early 60s was I wasn't happy with my spirit and my soul, and I needed to pay more attention to aspects of my life that I put on hold. I'm very contented with what I achieved in that time, but as I've turned into the 70s, I've got one real goal that still remains, and that is I want to get to my end time with a healthy soul and a healthy spirit. Yes, I want to arrive at my funeral late. Yes, I want to spend my last dollar to the taxi driver or the hearse that takes me to my resting place. Yes, I want to slide into my grave sideways. I want to do all those things, but most of all, I want to arrive there with a healthy soul and healthy spirit. No wouldas, shouldas, could have done, may have done, like some of my uncles did and my fathers did. None of those recriminations. I want to live life very fully, but there's nothing more important to me than having a healthy soul and healthy spirit. And I've gone back to rebuild myself theologically and even morally over the last couple of years, and you have been part of that journey. I've shared part of that journey with you in a previous talk when I had to sit and talk because my leg was gone. I've still got a chair where if my leg gives out, I'm still going to have to sit down. But that's part of my journey. But part of that journey is the reason that I'm here today. There's three reasons that are the genesis of me standing up here today. Welcome, by the way. Good to see you. Good to see you, Suzanne. And the first part of that is, you may remember that several weeks ago, Dr. Larson stood up and he presented chapter 19, I think it was. And that was a very rich chapter. And during that, he knew that I had some interest in neuroplasticity because I had a conversation with him previously that where I am in my journey is I want to understand what technologies God uses and the Holy Spirit uses when they interface with us. When God says, I will give you a new heart, did he? What did he mean? When I will send you the Comforter, what does he mean? How do you access that Comforter? What does the Comforter do? Let alone all the whole angelology theology that some Adventist friends that I have are in it, some are out of it, and I don't know where that is, but you need to inform me because I'm not familiar with that. But we have this idea of a divine interface, and some of us have this sense of providence, which is yet another discussion, maybe part of this discussion. But in that presentation, David focused on two key things. He presented Jack Provonsha's character filter. And also, Jack had in that chapter several statements from Mrs. White that talked about brain nerves. So so I'm sitting there thinking, wow, how do I put this into the paradigm that I've built? And over the years, and I was having trouble engaging and following the static model with the filter in there and stimulus coming in and stimulus coming out, and what happens to the residue that's filtered out, and what happens to what gets behind it, and how does it circle back in the feed loop to do whatever. And so the static model wasn't really working for me because I used the living brain as a dynamic model. But I was very impressed with the statements that Jack had selected from Mrs. White, and one of them should be photocopied and maybe put on your fridge with some kind of medallion to hold it up there, because it's very powerful, and I just want to go back and just read that one to you. The brain nerves, which communicate with the entire system, are the only medium through which heaven can communicate with man and affect his inmost life. You see? So when we say let's kind of unpack this a little bit. She doesn't say that you think through the heart or you access your brain through your viscera. I know through the vagus nerve you can, but he's not uploading into our brain through any kind of organ. So things like trust your gut feeling, go with your heart. This is not the language of God. This is not necessarily a divine language. So even think with your heart. The heart is a pump. You can't think with your heart. This whole game is being played out, and this exercise being played out in the brain. And so I thought it was interesting that she uses the word affect and not effect, because if the word was effect, that would mobilize something. It activates something. It affects something. But the word is affect. And affect incorporates not just the motor piece of it, but your cognitive domain, your perceptual domain, okay, and your emotional domain, your emotional intelligence. So it gets to all of you. So when you read this here, think of the word affect. It's total in its concept, as well as the entire system being the only mechanism which heaven can communicate with mankind. So we're going to go and see if we can find Jack Provonsha's shorter this morning. I'm going to have a mouthful of water. And to do that, I'm going to cleave open the brain and a sagittal section there. We're going to look apart, take a lateral view of that. We're going to look around the lobes, and then we're going to look at some very, very primary and important association centers, in particular the limbic system, which I know my friend over here has strong interest in that. So that's going to be the journey. I'm not here to attack faith. I'm a strong believer in informed faith. I don't have a lot of confidence in blind faith, and I want to eliminate as much blind faith and convert it to informed faith as I can. That is part of my journey. The other reason, so I'm definitely pro-science, but not against faith. The other part of my journey, just to clarify, is where I am in my rebuild. And that is, I started this time last year, maybe a little bit before, when I started to attend here, was I had to start with, is there a God? It took me about 9 months of reading to convince myself that there is a God. Then the next question becomes is, why should I care? How important is God? That was a really short journey, because in today's world, it's pretty evident, that God is pretty important. And I don't think we talk enough about the importance of God. And the next thing after that was, well, what does this quiet, invisible God want from me? And so I now, through the Sabbath school, I have 8 stakes in the ground, or 8 pillars to my rebuilt faith. And I'm hoping I'll have enough by the end of the year, now maybe 4 or 6, and that will be the platform that I will live and die on. I will go to my grave on this platform, but hold myself accountable to it, and anyone else that I know and talk to can hold me accountable to that platform. So then I get up to is, well, how do I communicate with this God? How do I talk to God? How do I optimize communication with God? That gets to neuroplasticity, what we're about today. And so it's very germane to my current interest. So in terms of introducing this topic, is anyone here knows that any one of those words is the work of a lifetime. So the whole idea that I can stand here for 30 minutes and give you a comprehensive understanding of the interplay between these, it's absurd. These are lifetime of learning, but what I do have to do is put some boundaries on this. So when I'm talking about neuroanatomy, I'm talking about gross functional neuroanatomy. We'll look at the lobes. When I'm talking about theology, I'm talking about Protestant SDA theology. There's a lot of seasoned SDAs here, so I'm talking about us, just addressing this room here. When it comes to morality, well, who's interested in morality? Everybody's interested in morality, or should be. So whether you're a scientist, and certainly science needs to be moral in terms of its findings and its honesty, but the fact is, ethicists, and there are moral researchers, and I'm going to summarize this book for you next week, the science and the good. What is neuroscience doing in its attempt to find morality and build morality and suggest morality? It's not going very well at all, because they start without God. So you're looking at secular morality, and the end of that is, and not to get into too much into next week's work, is there is a state of stasis, moral nihilism or nihilism. There is no such thing. They can find no such thing in the brain in terms of right and wrong. It's just a social engineering experience. It's all a product of social learning, of our culture, our subculture, and there's nothing that is innate. I'm getting in front of myself for next week. So, but when it comes to morality, everybody should have a say on morality. That's my approach, because at the end of the day, spirituality is an individual matter. Your relationship with God is an individual matter. Your morality, as you understand God, what He wants from you, is an individual matter. So I'm not here to talk about social justice or what is socially acceptable in today's climate. That's for somebody else. I'm not here to talk about humanism and other moralism and other forms of contemporary morality. This is individual, personal morality in the context of you and God. That's what I'm limiting myself to. So somebody else can do that other stuff. I'm going to have to pivot on my good leg here. So very quickly, it's an itinerary because it's a journey. I'm going to address a couple of, briefly, some conceptual models, core concepts of neuroplasticity, just to revisit those, and why neuroplasticity is important to believers, because without it we have no hope, we have no ability to change. If you don't believe in this, you're a fatalist, you're a determinist, you're into predestination, and I find Adventists playing with the margins of determinism. And so we're going to go around the cerebral lobes. I'm going to talk from a functional, non-pathological point of view. So when it comes to neuroplasticity, there are 4 types of neuroplasticity. I'm only going to address one. But I am going to get into this thing called higher cortical functions down the bottom. Concept formation, reasoning, learning. We know where that is in the brain. We know how that interfaces with other parts of the brain. Then we'll talk about some applied neuroplasticity. How is morality built? And the competition between nature and nurture, which is really a fierce debate out there, and there's a lot of competition that goes on all the time within your body between nature and nurture, and there's some current films out at the moment that address that. Are we born with an innate sense of right and wrong? So you start forming your questions for the discussion time, because these are some of the questions I'm going to put out there. But I want to try and get to, as close as possible, this divine human interface. Where is it in the brain, and how does it function? And I'm going to be suggesting, rather than filtering, because a lot of information, most information goes in raw. You don't get the chance to filter it. The brain decides what it's going to store and what it's going to retrieve. And so a lot of information goes in very, very raw. For example, oh, perish the thought. I wish I hadn't seen that. Oh, I'm haunted by those thoughts. Oh, I saw too much. I wish I hadn't seen that. That's all statements of the raw information that you're giving into your brain, that the brain has to sort out and decide what it's going to do with it. And it's constantly reconciled. The parietal lobe, which is the master of sensation that filters all this sensation, and is actually working on it while you sleep, and deciding what does it store, what does it shed, what's important, and it puts it into a context. And without the context, it's pretty meaningless. So basically, I'm going to be speaking more in terms of how the brain functions, and it's a workshop. It's an assembly plant. It's a synthesizer. It has some kind of filtering behaviors, though, and we'll address those. But one of the things in the end, and as you know from the questions I ask and the statements I make, is I'm often taking up the position of the non-believer. Somebody who's outside and coming back in. To spiritual matters, and that really is part of my journey. But I have a real burden for most of my friends that have disassociated from the church. They're no longer believers, they're atheists, they're agnostics. And I had a very upsetting phone call during the week from a lifetime friend who I called up to see how he's doing, and he's been a loyal Seventh-day Adventist, tithe-paying Seventh-day Adventist, but he couldn't talk about God because he's just so angry. He's about my age, and life hasn't turned out the way he thought it would. And the promises that his parents made to him, if he did certain things, and his teachers did certain things, that he would end up in a good place in life. But the fact is, he's not in a good place in life, and he's angry about it. And he's looking to disassociate, and he might move to a more kind of passive church, or no church at all. And I couldn't have a conversation with him because he gave me a heads up he doesn't want a conversation about God. But I know his problems are set in his expectations. He expected God and the Holy Spirit to do things for him they never said they would do, and can't do. And so we have to be very careful. And I'm suggesting here we need to tune up our language, because I know from trying to engage former Adventists that I care about, I was at college with, at school with, I find myself using expressions, and they go, whoa, what do you mean? And we have this jargon, this Christian, Protestant, Seventh-day Adventist jargon, that under analysis, much of it we don't believe, we sing about it, we put it into our prayers, because that's how we're enculturated, but we don't necessarily believe it. And when it comes time to explain it to somebody else, they're going, glazed eyes, I don't know what you're talking about. Our language is not conducive to the way that young people think today, and the way that analysts think. And I'm going to point out some ways, more next week, is things that we need to clean up. It's not intellectually honest to be pushing stuff and expecting the brain to do things that the brain can't do and doesn't do, or God to do things that he doesn't do. And I'm just going to finish off on this before I move into the other stuff. Is my other position is, because I think it is one of the great battles that we've got that we don't talk about. You know who Stephen Hawkins is? He passed away last year, so you know who he was. He was by many scientists, he was deemed to be the world's smartest man. He was an English guy who had this deformity, lived his life in a wheelchair, respirator, and he died last year. He's an astrophysicist. And he was a Christian God believer, put it this way. He was a God believer up until about the year 2000. And then after that, he put out a statement that God provides no utility to humankind. And it's not a concept that should be promoted or supported. And last year, he came out before he died, early in the year, with a statement that said, in 200 years, there will be no Christians left on the face of the earth. Well, what if he's even right to the 50th percentile? And it's alleged that he said that because he didn't give me a call saying, Rodney, you know, this is really what I think. But it was written in the Wall Street Journal. And so I thought that's the real challenge of Adventism, is really wrapped up in Christianity, the survival of Christianity. Because what he's saying there is, and let me just point out, I can look over 4 generations myself, and I'm 71. So 200 years is 10 generations. That's how quickly, if you extrapolate from the attrition loss of Protestantism and Christianity, that's how fast people are leaving the church. If you factor into that the passivity ratio of active to inactive Adventists, it's very disengaging. And that raised the 2 questions to me would be, is what replaces it? If Judeo-Christianity disappears or drops by 50%, what replaces it? The vacuum? Humanism? You know, secularism? These are the kind of questions that keep me awake at night, and if anyone else thinks about it. But the other statement in here really is Adventism, along with Christianity, a recessive religion? You know, and if you look at the attrition rate, he's got a case, an argument that it is a recessive religion. Then what is the dominant religion that would replace the thinking of humans in that time? And of course, you go to England and you see these and Scotland and Europe, these beautiful churches, Christian churches, all empty. Okay. Conceptual models. The character filter, I'm not going to put that up or speak any more about that. Some of you recall what that character filter was, a static model. And then my friend here, Dr. Keto, did several sessions, which was really, Doctor, what I would call a behavioral model. If you want to know what Daniel was about here, read his book. You can actually do it in a setting, once in an evening sitting, to pick up a highlighter and go through and underscore every time he uses the word decision-making or choices. See, it's a behavioral model, an educational model. But it's very good, and I'm going to end up in some of the same places that Daniel ends up, because he's looking at the brain, he's looking at how learning occurs, and in the end, that's really important. So when you're talking about, so my model is going to be more a dynamic, anatomical, biological model. Neurophysiological is, when we're talking about the brain, everything up there is electrical. Everything is stored as electricity. That's really what we talk about. Everything is conducted as electricity. And so you know, that's just important to acknowledge. We divide it into grey matter and white matter. The grey matter is that cortex, the outer layers. The best way to think about that, because I'm assuming that not everyone has a healthcare background here, some of you are going to have you know, maybe less than that. But the best metaphor really is the cauliflower. And the cauliflower's got these pods around the outside. You see, it's got these white stems, but around the outside it's got the grey-greeny pod. That is how your brain kind of looks. And that cortex, that outer layer, is your cortex. And that's the grey matter. But to comprehend this, try to comprehend this you know, from an engineering, divine creation point of view, but try and argue it from a more of an atheistic, agnostic, or evolutionist point of view, you know, is neurons, around 86 billion. Each neuron emits about 1,000 pulses per second. And there are these junctions, which are called synapses, and they're there in the trillions, you know. And somehow this is a product or the aggregation of you know, a slow creep or slow grind evolution process. And then there's the white matter, which are the fibers, and these are the axons. We call them axons. And at the end, they have these kind of claw-like feet, which are dendrites. Now, biochemistry is for somebody else. I just have to note it, though, if you're going to be talking about the brain, you can't step around biochemistry. The brain is relatively intolerant to changes there. You know, if the the electrolytes go out, the mineral salts there, the sodium-potassium ratios and that kind of stuff, you become disoriented very quickly and dysfunctional very quickly and actually risk your life. So the brain is very sensitive to that. But we have these things called neurotransmitters that work in with our hormones, and I'm not going to get into that too much, but the brain, different lobes of the brain have different densities and concentrations of neurotransmitters. For example, dopamine is found commonly, in, at least in concentrated levels, in the frontal brain, and there's reasons for that. And I might just touch on some of those, but that's not my area. And the whole pharmaceutical industry, their brain care and behavioral change is not what I'm going to get into today. That's for somebody else that's got a better background on this. When it comes to neuroplasticity, the key concept here is the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life, throughout life. But yes, it is more plastic in earlier life, but it can occur throughout life. And then specifically, if you want to use a technical jargon, it's the cortical cells, these neurons, can adjust or reassign. Sometimes researchers use the word invade an adjacent area. That they can adjust their activity, which means storage, retrieval, and synthesis, the putting back of it, the putting it together in response to new situations that occur in the environment, being the human physical internal environment, but also your external environment. But to note, plasticity runs both ways. It's both positive and negative. And so good and evil use the same pathway. We don't have bad parts of our brain and good parts of our brain. We have common pathways and common storage area. And we've all lived long enough to see good people do bad things and bad people do good things. And you can find examples out there, and I find the whole Rwanda genocide experience from an Adventist point of view, given that the greatest density at the time of Seventh-day Adventists in the world was right there in Rwanda. And so how did Adventists get caught up in that? And that gets into kind of primal culture versus Adventist doctrines and a general conference messaging and whatever. And that can be a side discussion here. But my question in the end, what makes us primarily good and what makes us primarily bad? Or does evil run through the heart of every man, and we are always and ever will be, therefore, part evil and part good? And that's because it's there structurally, and therefore it's not a correctable situation. So it gets back to what you grow, what you learn, and what you grow. Now, the other three areas of neuroplasticity are to do with pathology, getting one hemisphere to take over the work of the other hemisphere, getting some substructure in the brain that is designated or hardwired to do certain things to adopt other functions. That's what you do as a therapist. But this is the one that we need to pay attention to, and it's commonly called in the research cortical map extension. This is the neuroplasticity that I'll address here. And so if you take the cortex of the brain and you stretch it out, it's about 2.5 square feet. So if you pick up a quarter size of piece of paper and you assemble like 4, 5, or 6 of those, that's about how big the cortex is of the human brain. If you look at the next primate down, it's like a strip of postage stamps, but the thing is in the apes and the chimp world is the cortex is very, very thin, tissue paper thin. You can almost see through it. So the strength of the human cortex is also its depth, not just its size, but also the depth of the cortex. And the other part of it is when you get down to the key processing, so-called synthesis and filtering and selection, areas of the brain that are deep in the brain, they're also grey matter. They're not white matter. And that's very important because that's where you decide who you are. That's where you is assembled to present to the world and yourself. It is deep brain, and it's in these association areas, including the limbic system. And so the other point I'd make here, and I'll get a little off track, but whether it's Dave Larson or Graham Stacey or Rodney Corker or Alan White, God has to use what he's designed, what he's structured. We're all using the same structural elements. The only change is some weighting of use and also the degree of excitability. All this is about, in terms of the process of habituation and laying down neurons and tracks, is in terms of how people manifest themselves. The amount of noise that the brain creates when they're being mapped, in terms of imaging, is the excitability that is between neurons. And that can alter, because the brain is adjusting that strength, that amplitude, pretty much all the time. And it can happen relatively quickly. That's the interesting thing about neuroplasticity. But all thinking and motor activity, motor planning, everything starts in that cortex. And it processes the information and can reallocate it. So inevitably, I just put this in here because we're going to end up here, is that the brain recognizes repetition of behavior. Training has to do with repetition. And it can change that the map area that's been assigned to a particular behavior. It can grow it, enlarge it, make it more excitable. So the cortex grows and shrinks in response to behaviors that are exercised. We come back to Dr. Keto here. It's about choices, decisions, actions, practice it. But in particular, we don't talk enough about this here, is in particular, the emotional context is very important. You see, we are social creatures, and the power of what is primary in store, the primacy of information, is done contextually within an emotional context. And so your so-called emotional intelligence is very important. So you reward behavior, you kind of socialize your behavior, and it's going to become embedded much more quickly. And the interesting thing is that behavior change in terms of growing a new pieces of cortex or activating them can occur very quickly. 1 or 2 days. Think of learning how to play a musical instrument. What you're actually doing is activating a new part of your brain, a different part of your brain. A new language. A piece of electronic appliance or gadgets. Look how quickly and malleable young people's minds are, and how quickly they can, a smartphone or computer, whatever. They're just computer games all over it so quickly. I resist it. We struggle with those. But that's the power also of the young mind, the adolescent mind. And to move along here, there are 2 important concepts in learning here. And the first one applies to my Adventist background the first time around, is learning what we call implicit learning. And we had actually a couple of weeks ago a guy who talked about implicit theology. It has got no power, really. It is slow, passive theology. Versus explicit learning, what is intentional and motivated. That's powerful. And that's what's noisy when neuromapping is occurred. Intentional motivated learning, and just again some other things. At birth, a baby has about 2,500 synapses, of which we have trillions, per neuron. At 2 and 3 years, it's 15,000. At 18, it's fallen back to 10,000. And at maturity, we have about 7,000 or 8,000. You see, and so what is happening is pruning occurs. And that's how character is developed and becomes pretty consolidated. And once you're into your teen years and your late teen years, my father and grandfather had this memorable saying that I still recall, was, if you have trained a horse by the time it's 4, and a boy by the time it's 14, neither of them will ever be any good. You see, you heard that? That's recognizing the power of, learning power of the adolescent. And so we get to our age and we get set in our ways. And occasionally I get even messages at Christmas time. I got a couple of those where, I'm comfortable with what I believe, and I've resigned myself to the great mysteries of life, which I will never fathom, but I'm really pretty much comfortable where I am. What I'm saying is, don't challenge me with anything new too much. I'm comfortable where I am, and we do have to reconcile ourselves, and we'll never know everything and stuff, but it's like, don't rock my boat too much because I'm okay where I am. I really respect that. So, can you teach an old dog, from what I've said so far, can you teach an old dog new tricks? Can you? Yes. What's the condition? What's the condition? The old dog has to want to learn new tricks. If you don't want to learn new tricks and can't commit motivation and intention to it and repetition to it, those kind of things, the old dog is just going to be an old dog. Neuroimaging, just quickly, because I don't want to get sidetracked into that, but growth, when they've got this functional MRIs that can map activity and give people different questions. And Forrester raised this with a couple of weeks ago. That is very interesting. I've tried to investigate that a bit. But growth, when you're growing a new part of the brain and developing new cells or activating cells or reassigning them, it's very noisy and it picks up. But maturity is very, very quiet. So many of these studies that are done overreach, and they're not quite sure what they're measuring. But for example, Forrest gave the example, I think, and it was on the news, of testing Democrats, for example, and Republicans, and different parts of their brain were active during the same kind of question. It's like, whoa, kind of what's going on here. But it actually makes a good point. it makes 2 points. Is number one is it doesn't mean to say the brain's not active. If it's matured and strong and running, it's quiet because it's established. So it's not that it wasn't working. It's just simply is that it's matured and it's quiet. But the other part of it is that when we know the diversity that's in this country, they're splitting this country, and people say, oh, we just have different values. When you listen to them talk and they say no, they have the same values. What they're not recognizing is they have different brains. Because once you start to get into the journey of what is a platform, what is a narrative, that you buy into, you're actually developing part of a brain that's different to somebody else. So what happens is when you talk, and if you don't can't connect on a talking, what do? Then you start poking each other in the eyes, because you're not connecting, you're not understanding. But understand, you've laid down different parts of your brain. That's what the challenge is here. But that gets back to learning theory and what you habituate, what you practice, and what gets pruned and what doesn't get pruned. So to summarize this neuroplasticity, the proportion of gray matter can be reassigned, location, response, and also size. And the excitability is very important. The connections, those synapses, can be weakened or strengthened over time as a result of repeating activity. It depends what you're into and what you're thinking about and what you're doing and the amount of repetition that goes on. So in short, without overreaching here, you want to be different, think it, see it, feel it, plan it, practice it, reward it, socialize it, habituate it. Okay, that's the summary. But the overreaching is there are shucksters out there and all kinds of faux scientists making millions of dollars of how to improve athletic performance, how to improve performance at all levels, and particularly if you eat and drink my supplements and that kind of stuff and mix this up together. It's a good way to fast way to become a millionaire, but it's really basing and overreaching on where the science is. But as I said before, note what is very important is the strength of the connection, and we have some master control centers in our brain that recognize practice, focus, determination, and intent. Just to end off on this here, change adults is definitely more modest and less dramatic. Manage your expectations. There's a lot of overreaching here. You can't necessarily recreate yourself and do it easily with a few repetitions. This is very intentional planned activity. Beware of willpower. As my dear departed mother-in-law would point out, Rodney, you're overweight and you simply need to exercise more willpower. It's really quite a simple matter. And I kind of sat in my craw a little bit and I said, well, Mum, there's lots of areas in my life that I think I've displayed huge amounts of willpower. So I don't think it's basically a willpower issue. And then a piece of my brain turned on that was that maybe it was just a little narky, but it went in the direction is, I live in a blue zone called Loma Linda, and it's a health-focused location. And I've driven around there for several years. I've yet to see a single that says willpower sold here. I can find a place I can plug in an electric vehicle and get my battery charged, but I can't get a charge of willpower. And as a joke, I went down to the market and said, can you sell me a can of willpower? And they looked at me and realized I was pulling their leg and saying, no, I said, you don't have it on the shelf? Over the counter, can I just buy it? No, we don't have willpower here. Be careful of overreaching on willpower. Be careful of the language you use and what you mean of. But around Loma Linda, if you know where I can buy some willpower, I'll go in and get a can of it. Beware of DNA proclivities, haven't got time to get into that. But the brain decides what it will memorize and what it won't. And if Forrest is standing, it means I'm running out of time, but this is kind of where I did plan to end this. But Forrest, I just want to go around and end with this particular slide, but I want to give you more of an orientation to it. I'm not sure whether I should use the green or the red decision. But this frontal lobe here, this is where intuition, reasoning, where what is socially acceptable behavior, cognitive function, concrete thinking versus abstract thinking. My favorite definition of concrete thinking is somebody who's thoroughly mixed up and permanently set. But the interesting thing is, from a theological point of view, I've heard in this class we've mentioned people that are fundamentalists. And while I was in the waiting room, I talked to a lady, a very spiritual lady, and asked her what was her approach to reading the Bible. She says, I'm a liner. And I said, what is a liner? She said, I read the Word of God line by line. And that's how God talks to me. But we also know that, you know that there are over 30,000 Protestant registered churches, Protestant churches. All can't be right, all can't be wrong, but a lot of them are built upon implied religion. You see, juxtapose a few texts together, feel compelled about those texts, develop another religion, you see. But as Dave mentioned to us a couple of weeks ago, and it's profoundly true, is in quoting, Maxwell, Graham Maxwell. The moral of the story is the story, see? And see, that's abstract thinking. And that happens up here in the brain. So when people have trauma to the brain, that's what they lose. Now down here is where you have some emotional intelligence. But down here is where emotional control is set, this lower quadrant of the brain. And there's some science that supports that. So rage, car rage and that kind of stuff is down here. But more the reasoning is up here. But spirituality, a sense of right and wrong, morality, is this what is called this prefrontal area. It's strip down here, in here. That is where you define yourself as a personality, as a person. Just quickly, is down here is your temporal lobe, and the temporal lobe here is about memory, and it's also about hearing. This is where your hearing is, because your ear sits off the side of that here. This lobe back here is your occipital lobe. That's where visual interpretation occurs. But the real interesting one, and maybe Jack's filter, is kind of up in here. This is your parietal lobe. This is where all your sensation is processed, where integration occurs. This is seeing with knowing. It occurs in this parietal lobe area. And to finish off with, where these three lobes come together, is a posterior association area of gray matter that's processing this stuff all the time. You know, 1,000 pulses per second. And down here is the anterior association area that pulls all the stuff that's up here in this part of the lobe and directs it down here into some of the central areas. Those two, and underneath that is the limbic system, which we'll get into next week, because now we're getting to, if God has a workshop, it is there in that area. If the devil has a playground, it's in that area. If there's a divine human interface, it really is going on in that area. And we can get to determine a lot of it, but we have to understand how it works. And maybe what I should do there, we're kind of out of time.
Well, you know, you're coming back next week, and so we can answer more questions. So.
Well, I'll finish off with two overheads on the frontal lobe, because that's where we're going to spend the frontal and parietal lobes. The interesting thing that I find on the parietal lobe, because that's where sensory management is conducted, is just a little idiosyncrasies, is when we say, oh, I wish I hadn't seen that. Oh my gosh, what just happened? Oh my gosh, what just happened? Did I see that? Is that true, what I just saw? You cup your hands over your parietal lobes because it's like your head might explode if you didn't hold them together. But it's an instinctive response for your head. You don't go, oh, boy, frontal lobe stuff. That's really wise. Need to think about that there for a while. It's like, oh, gosh. You know, you go to your parietal lobes. And so cognition, complex planning, is the frontal lobe. Concept formation is, and I've treated a lot of patients with frontal lobe dysfunction. Reasoning, problem solving, sorting, prioritizing. Oh, very important. The law of consequences, of cause and effect, called the rule of learning often, is there in that frontal lobe area. Emotional regulation, down more towards the bottom of that. But it's not where emotional intelligence is. Emotional intelligence is really a composite area from somewhere else. Language comprehension, speech production, all in that frontal lobe. And of course, no language, no thinking, no learning. And to finish off with, the frontal lobe houses all these higher cortical functions that separate us from any other mammal and allow us to engage the concept of a God and God talk, and godliness, and build godliness. Empathy, that's the word I was looking for. Empathy, insight, intuition, morality, social judgment, and volition, which means get up and go. You have a frontal lobe injury, that's one of the first things that disappears, is volition. If you're a heavy pot smoker, that's what I see. I lived in a cooperative in London with musicians for 18 months, and I had witnessed firsthand different kind of drugs and stuff and effect on the body. And certain an effect on the mind, and certainly pot smoking and volition, and that's their one of the few things that's scientifically established is the effect on volition and affect. And affect being your tone, your mood, your background. Affect is very flat. You get a lobotomy or an injury to the frontal lobe, then you fall to a very kind of monotone, flat look. Now this is a good place to finish, because we're talking here about values and virtues. We need to decide, when we talk about traits, what is a trait and what is a value? What is a virtue? And I missed this the first time around in Adventism. I'm much more sensitive to it now, is because, you know, when someone has a sunny disposition, or they have a pleasant demeanor, you know, or they're sullen, you know, for example, we use these as descriptors of people's mood or their behavior at some point of time. The fact is, within the Christian framework, when God is saying, Jesus is saying, I've got these gifts for you. This is how you should be living, with joy, peace, and joy, and love, forgiveness, you know, patient, long-suffering, those kind of things. Okay, the first logical thing is that my experience? Because if that's not your experience, you've got to say, why am I disconnected from this? Why isn't this my gift? Why aren't I enjoying these gifts? Because that's what God said he wants to give me, or Jesus says they want to give me. Okay, and then it becomes a matter of, is it a trait or is it a virtue? So happiness to me used to be just a trait. It's something you display or you don't display, depending upon what you decide your mood is going to be at the moment, the people around you. But once you turn it over and say, no, happiness is a virtue. You have a burden to practice it. You have to display it. You see, you have to own it and possess it. And I think that's what God frankly wants us to do. It's a choice, you see. And one of my metaphors for this was when God talked to, at Sinai, when he talked to the refugees from Egypt. He did a deal with them. I got the promised land for you. I promised your forefathers about this promised land, but there's a condition. You have to go in and put your feet on the ground. You need to go in and take it. And if you don't put your feet on the ground, I ain't giving it to you. They had to claim it, you see? Same thing here. You have to claim these things, which means you have to practice them, repeat them, and apply them. And then you can have that. But thinking that you're waiting on God and he's going to download or upload, you know, a whole set of traits and characteristics that are not part of your past, whether it's genetic or not, is just is not how it's going to work. And finish off with the context here. Memory and perception is very important. And Forrest, thank you for tolerating me going a little bit over. But you can start with some questions, and we'll roll into next week. And I have the right to defer questions to anyone I choose in this audience to respond, because I do not see it. I'm aware there are people out here that are better prepared than I am. I'm chagrined by that knowledge. But that's okay. But at least I can start presenting a slightly different model, and we can go from there.
Thank you so much. This is a fantastic presentation. I'm glad I came today. I teach in the School of Religion, and I spend a lot of time with dental students and medical school students. What I have found, and I'm very interested in this topic, and I have been using it more and more in my teaching, especially because I spend a lot of time with young people who are quite diverse in their belief systems, but they believe in science.
Yes.
And I have found this a wonderful way to connect with them and get them thinking theologically about how we experience change and growth in our lives. So thank you. This is really helpful for me. That's a comment. So my question is: you mentioned at the beginning about how this was what you were thinking here individually, how we change.
Yes. Okay.
I was thinking, if Thomas Aquinas were alive today, I think he would be very interested in neuroplasticity as the virtue ethicist. But what's interesting to me is that his thinking was very much in the context of community, of the church that forms us and shapes us. So, are you familiar with Dan Siegel's work in interpersonal neurobiology?
No. I've heard the name.
Yeah, well, it's a very similar field, and this idea that I thought maybe you've come across anything like this, where relationally in family systems and other types of community, that what's going on in my brain affects the brains of people around me.
Yes.
And I wonder if you've, I'm dumbing something down that's very complex that Siegel's work he's doing, but anyways, I don't know if you've come across anything.
Well, just two comments. This book, which I'll summarize next week, it shows that in terms of trying to build a social morality, a platform of moral imperatives, for the world, with all this globalization and commingling that's going on, is very, very weak. They say there's no such thing as right or wrong, and that is simply a social engineering product and experiment, and it's very weak. So in terms of neuroscience, trying to, for centuries, describe what is, we can describe what is, and it's very suggestive. But the other part of that is trying to get to what ought to be. There's really no agreed upon platform, because people can't agree upon a definition of morality, and if you can't define morality, you can't do a study. There's no demonstration, there's no reproduction, or there's no understanding. But that's how immature this science is. But in terms of the social context, is very important, because it's part of our training as Adventists. We went to Adventist churches, we went to Adventist schools. Our cousins, our relatives were Adventists, so we got indoctrinated and enculturated socially into a way of thinking and even into a way of speaking. And I don't say that in a denigrating way. I just recognize that as part of my background. And the morality of indoctrination is something that I'm going to put on the board next week, and you can start thinking about that. Because if it's welfare, social welfare, and safety, indoctrination is a really good thing. But in religion, it can go either way, especially when we're given a choice of decision making. But when it comes back to finish up on this whole social concept, is I hear people, and as a policy analyst for 20, 30 years, I hear people sit there and go, political justice or social justice. I'm into social justice. People are all over the place on that. There's no common agreement on what social justice is. And the Hebrew people say there is no such thing as an oxymoron. There is only justice. If it's meant to be social justice, write it into law, administrative law, then you can implement it, you can oversee it, you can measure it, and you can adjudicate it. But until you've done that, there is just justice, and justice is jurisprudence. That's what the law should understand, and what the law does. And so I'm not into national conversations about racism and other kind of topical things, because my approach is, how do you eat an elephant? How do you create social justice or a platform for what is socially acceptable? You do it the same way as you eat an elephant. One bite at a time. One mind at a time. It doesn't happen through national conversations. In my 30 years, national conversations about any controversial issue have been dismal. Anyone else?
Right here.
Wow. Welcome back, my friend.
Thank you. I hope that my comment makes sense. I forget the name of the Sabbath school director.
Dr. Larson?
No,
Oh.
the GC.
Oh, okay.
He's a Jewish guy.
Cliff Goldstein.
Goldstein came to our class, and I said, Cliff, I have a difficult question, but please be careful with the answer. And I've been blessed and said, be careful with the question. So when I listen a lot of the Supreme Court cases, because they already put it on the almost instantly, the audio cases. And I see the biggest brains in the world fighting for arguments. So my point is that the deepest thinker and the faster thinker is the best. And I have a statement from Sister White that says, when the heart is pure, rich treasures of wisdom will flow forth. And my point is that to me, purity plays in the wisdom and the faster and the deepest thinking. Have you ever considered this purity in a physical or morally or whatever way?
Yes. I know that your email has the word purity in it. So I know it's a focal point and a locus of your whole thinking. And I think that's a good thing. But we have to define our terms. What is purity and how is it obtained? Is it genetically passed on somehow in our blood and in our DNA? Is it groomed and is it developed? And if we went around the room and got people to define purity, I would suggest that we don't have a common element here. I would even suggest, in terms of the way the research is going on this here, would be we could spend 3 months in this classroom just to try and come up with 12 moral imperatives that would be a platform for the world, and I doubt if we could do it. And I also doubt that we can come up with purity. But the fact is, we understand what purity is. And so there's another statement here that resonated with me. By beholding, you become changed. But then it means you have to apply it. You have to behold, you have to model, and you have to practice it. You see, intentionally practice it. Then you have to socialize it and culture it, and then it becomes habituated, you see. So the whole thing would apply with purity. Define what purity is, you know. If that's where you want to go, build a model for developing purity, and do it the same way as everybody else learns and becomes habituated in seeing things a certain way or behaving in a certain way. I want to give Daniel a go here because I hope that some of the things I said, Daniel, resonate with you, but hopefully it's not too much that you've already discarded.
I don't have any controversy, but I might share something that that I read from Mrs. White many years ago. I can't quote where it's from exactly, but she was describing Satan. And when she saw him at this point in his existence, she was quite shocked because he had lost his, what she considered to be a very prominent and beautiful forehead. And it had slanted down and somehow, and she was quite appalled at how he had changed in appearance for the negative side. And it sort of fits part of what you were saying today, in which if you don't use it, you lose it. And there, it's a well-known fact that your brain, as it pulsates and as it moves, forms the shape of your skull. So I guess over time, it's very possible that because he did not use his frontal lobe, or stopped using his frontal lobe to the extent that he had when he was in his former position, it just started to atrophy, and therefore later on it reflected the fact that his frontal lobes weren't the shape they were, and therefore his brow had changed.
You're right, that's how she describes him. She
Right.
says when he was the covering cherub, he had a high, noble forehead, is the expression she uses. And when she saw him sitting, she said his forehead sloped back from his eyebrows,
Receding back.
sloping back. Exactly.
I forgot where that's from.
I think David was-
I think it was in spiritual gifts, but it could be in the Great Controversy. I don't remember now.
You know, we're going to have more discussion next week, and I think we're not even going to take a vote whether or not you should come back.
Okay.
But I know
David, sorry, can I just ask David, he's really very keen to say something. Do we have a...
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, and you have one more meeting scheduled, but we will schedule many more, because we have a lot to learn from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, very kind.
Okay, but thank you very much, Rodney, for your presentation today. I know there's going to, I saw some hands kind of going up. I know there's going to be more questions, so.
Can I just say, for next week, one of the things that I'm going to do is put a list of questions, and some of them are statements that Adventists make, and as a possible returning Adventist, you tell me whether this is language you use, whether we should maybe change the tone of it or prune it a little. But I want to put up some very challenging statements that I think are inconsistent with the way the brain works, and we confuse other people, non-believers, when we use them, and we ought to stop.
And before we have, I just want to make a clarification about, the brain, talking Democrats and Republicans. Really, this study was across national boundaries, and it was conservatives versus progressives.
Yes.
So in the United States, it is Republican, Democrat. Other countries, conservative party, liberal parties.
Well, on that note, it gets to the power of group thinking. You can decide whether that's moral or immoral. But the interesting thing in one of these studies, sorry to cut you off there, but just quickly, is that whether you're conservative or a progressive, there is one anchor thought or concept that predicts 90% probability that you will buy the entire platform on either side. So you've been thinking about what is that anchor belief that determines whether you're a progressive or a conservative. Okay.
At this time, let's have our benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.
Thank you for bearing with my walking out here. Last time, I had to sit and talk. Now I can stand, but it's ugly.